Alright, okay, so hello everyone and welcome to the latest discussion for Ancerious. Today we're going to be looking at culture in world building, uh, and inside of that, what is culture, how does it form, how does it impact a society, how does it generally impact geopolitics as a whole, things that are important to culture, such as figures, dates, history, and the prevalence of sort of heritage and tradition. We're going to be looking at diversity of cultures and intermingling, looking at sort of what counterculture is, what norms and taboos might arise from your types of cultures, how to write actual cultural shifts in your nation as a whole, and good examples of culture IRL and in Ancerios. So let me just close the door a second. And so we're going to be starting off with what is culture. So the culture as a whole is kind of this nebulous term that looks at sort of like general social behavior, the institutions of a people, their norms, and it kind of also encompasses their, knowledge, beliefs, art, laws, customs, habitats, kind of everything really. Just like we had with the science discussion, culture is this very expansive thing that doesn't really have a sort of set defined existence, and because it you know melts into everything else, it's going to be a very sort of generalized thing for a lot of parts, just like the society discussion was. But effectively, culture sort of forms as groups and individuals learn and develop and socialize and come to get to grips with their surroundings, their habitats, their environment, and the day-to-day sort of living, effectively. Um, and these things that they get used to, certain acts, um, certain beliefs that they might have, certain knowledge of day-to-day activities, all kind of sort of solidifies into a general, like, this is the norm for these people, or this is socially acceptable for these people, and this is now sort of like creating a bit of a society. This is what codifies and sort of creates culture, and this is like how it's born, and then culture just adapts. And as your society grows, more knowledgeable, it expands outwards to different places, encapsulates different people, different beliefs, and generally advances, your culture is going to change too, on the whole. So, obviously, given that culture is made up of this massive sort of like influx of different stimulus, and the fact that it's ever changing, it's going to affect your nation on literally every level. Like, we're talking about something that is not particularly talked about in a lot of like role plays, I find, and a lot of sort of sci-fi in general. A lot of the time, culture and the sort of like intricacies and details, but even the more kind of nebulous, overarching stuff is left out because it's not big flashy pew pew lasers, everyone shooting each other, for example. And because of that, it takes a back seat in comparison to stuff like, oh well, I want to know how the government works, or oh well, I want to know how the military works, or oh well, I want to see space battles, or look at my religion or whatnot. Now, all those things are an aspect of culture, and of course, but at the end of the day, culture is way more than just those things. And it's only when you get into really developing your entire nation as a whole could you really start to get a feeling of what your nature's culture's like, and then start developing more detailed aspects of it when you're extrapolating from the sort of greater whole. So, for example, if I am developing a nation, the typical foundations that I will look at is stuff like what's the government like, what's their history like, what's their society like, and what's their technological level. Those are my kind of like personal key foundations that I always kind of look at. Even if I'm doing something like a basic NPC or whatnot, I'll try to at least come up with a vague idea of what those four things are. Now, when you put together those four aspects and you learn about how they interlink, yeah, how does the military deal with the government? How does the government deal with, the religion, or like how has it developed in the history or whatnot? Once you've got all these kind of links, you can start extrapolating what kind of culture society will have. If a people have had a relatively sheltered existence as a nation, okay, and they haven't fought wars in a long time, they don't really have much of a military. Their history is one of prosperity for the most part for the last, however long. And their government is quite a sort of like laid back, liberal, sort of democratic base. Well, you're going to expect a culture that's pretty diverse, pretty accepting, and it's going to have wide-reaching effects on how they're going to look at their diplomatic doctrine, how they're going to look at art, how they're going to look at performances, how are they going to see other cultures or other people as a whole, how accepting are they going to be of immigrants, for example, and integration of other cultures, and how they're going to look at all of these different things that are very loosely based on everything else. Meanwhile, if you've got a nation that's been at war for the better part of its modern sort of history, and you've got a government that's very authoritarian and dictatorship-like, you've got a very big military, for example, your culture is going to be very, very, very different, and you can then extrapolate that from, how they're going to be able to look at things like, does this nation look at its own history and traditions as a concrete pillar of its entire existence, and one of the reasons that it's pushing this conflict is because of those very beliefs and traditions of itself, or trying to think that maybe it doesn't actually have a large emphasis on the arts and the performances and celebrating ancient sort of cultures or whatnot, because that's not applicable. It's not relevant to the modern day. It's all about trying to keep the state going and everyone doing their part. So culture will impact absolutely everything in your nation. As said, it's your knowledge, it's your society as a whole, it's how you do things, it's how your people are acclimatized to their surroundings, their everyday existence. And this will obviously affect geopolitics as a whole as well, rather than just your own nation. Now, this is the thing, is that again, we've kind of extrapolated, you're going to have your liberal nation that's, oh yeah, we love immigration or whatnot, and, your authoritarian state that's been at war for God knows how long might not be entirely trusting of outsiders. Well, this is instances where it's obviously going to be affecting your geopolitics. If your culture is deeply seated with historical instances of maybe the Ancerious colonial nation screwing around with you and fucking up your nation, then, culturally, your people are probably not going to be looking at the colonials in a good light. On the contrary, if your people have had a particular intervention from a more technologically empowered state, they might look very beneficially on sort of outside intervention, and they even might believe that, this state helping us through our toughest time was such a sort of like encapsulating part of our existence that we're now used to. We worship it because it was such this massive thing to us, and we celebrate it, and it's influenced all of our society and culture, that we're now going to do that for others. We now believe that we have to carry the torch to go out there to the galaxy and help others in their dire needs, yeah? And so that they can then continue the cycle. So you have all of these little things of, Barry down the local pub, he goes there every night to have his pint, and he knows how to work 9 to 5, and he generally knows what the government's like, and he knows what he loves, and he knows kind of what's going on in the world. He has his own little culture and his beliefs and how he lives his life. But then times that by your entire population, and you start to see like what people are going to think and how that thinking is going to influence your state. A key thing that I like to do is imagine your nation as its people. To think of, from not just a cultural aspect, but all sorts of aspects, really. Forgive me while I fight with this door a second. It doesn't actually shut. But from an aspect of, role play, it's very easy to sit down and think like, oh, well, the empire or whatever is going to do this and that and the other, and it believes this and it believes that. Okay, but is that your state saying that, or is that your people saying that? Because they're actually two different things, unless you're a hive mind. But, just because your sort of nation as a macro entity has a particular way of doing things and a particular approach, doesn't mean that every single person in your nation is just a cookie cutter same person, yeah? And this is where fleshing out things like your culture and its impact on your society and its impact on geopolitics can help make your nation feel alive and lived in, rather than a cookie cutter just like, oh yeah, everyone loves the god emperor because, why wouldn't they? Everyone, backs the genocidal war on the Globnarks, like, because why wouldn't they? Like, oh, everyone's completely okay with this like massive military / geopolitical action, and it's all okay because it's all within our beliefs and we all love it. Like, well, that's not really how things work in real life. I mean, just look at Western democracies. You have, the state supporting Ukraine. Well, that's cool. But, like, there are, in some cases, in some nations, quite sizable portions of the population that don't want that. They don't want that to be done. Or, in some nations, they even support Russia. And again, a lot of the populations don't want that to be done. Or, there's very different takes from what the population and, as such, the culture of such population may back than the state. Again, an example, Israeli-Palestine conflict. Just take the United States position on it, for Christ's sake. You've got the US completely backing Israel at every step. Meanwhile, there's a lot of people that don't agree with that. And they're all from different cultural backgrounds. And again, you can see how different culture, even within your nation, even in the sci-fi setting, in fact, even more so in the sci-fi setting, will affect different groups of people within your nation to think maybe different things on different topics. Maybe your nation, as a colonial, took in native planets as it expanded. Probably it was even peacefully. Maybe they even wanted to join, and they integrated into your nation. But now that 3AW was happening, and the colonials are being painted as the bad guys, yeah, maybe the colonials did do some good stuff for your nation. But, there's all this evidence that's come out from the Joe Badiah report and everything that's stating that the colonials are bad. Well, maybe your native population will be much more accepting of that standpoint, given their history, and be like, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't have given our sovereignty over to this entity. Maybe we actually kind of feel for the other natives that are being downtrodden because, that there is colonial abuse going on, and we actually don't agree with our nation's stance, and maybe we want to change that. So they'll start lobbying the government or the state to start taking a much more moderate stance in the whole affair. So, given that, we've sort of talked a bit about how impacts and how impactful, let's say, culture is in geopolitics and society, and I can sort of go on and on about examples of how it'll impact your nation on the sort of galactic stage. I've talked about sort of diversity of cultures and intermingling, and this is, I think, out of everything in this discussion, if you're going to take anything away from it, please take this particular segment away from it. Because as I said, in nation roleplay and in world building in general, there is so much cookie cutterness. Now, I'll explain that in a bit more detail. For example, you've got my nation, one of my nations, the Grand Empire of Capital. Yeah, we're going to take them at their height in the Second Ancerious War. Okay, and they are a ultra authoritarian state, heavily militaristic, heavily industrialized, complete surveillance state. Their culture is all about survival of the fittest, of control, of keeping your head down and getting on with it, of very brutalist, minimalist arts, traditions and such, because, they don't matter. At least they don't matter as much as doing your job, keeping the war machine going, keeping everything going, for example. Yeah. Now, that is a trope. That kind of nation is something that you'll see a lot in Nation RP. Hell, you'll even see it in a lot of sci-fi stories. Now, you will look at that nation, typically, and you will think, oh, well, there's either going to be, like, two kinds of people. Those who are being downtrodden, or those who are, praise the empress, praise the great leader. Yep, we're going to commit horrible war crimes, and everything's hunky-dory, and, glory to capital, like that. That's all that matters. You might think, oh, there's those kinds of people, but, like, yes, there are those kinds of people, and sometimes in many nations where you don't see a lot of cultural world building, they might be even the same people. Capital has a wide, diverse array of cultures. Now, they have their original, sort of like what we would say core culture, which is they're kind of descended from Greco-Roman inspirations from Earth, in character and out of character. They have a very militarist belief. They believe themselves superior in terms of genetics and mental capability to many others. But then you also have different stratas of society that will have different cultures. You will have the much more middle class that are given just enough leeway to know that they're being oppressed, but not enough for them to try and do anything about it. So they're intellectuals and the like who are helping the state, but will try to keep their heads down because obviously they don't want to be caught by the state surveillance and could be taken away. Meanwhile, you've got the workers who are all obviously keeping their heads down. They keep to themselves. They don't, do a lot, for example. And those are just like kind of very basic things. But you're going to have different cultures even within that based on different planets. Think of how many different cultures this planet has. Yeah? Just this planet. In fact, whatever country you are currently listening from, think of how many cultures are within your country. Yeah? Then think about how many within this planet. Then think about how many planets you might have within your space empire, yeah? Not just planets, you might have orbital habitats as well. You might have various bases elsewhere, okay? They will all have a distinctive individual culture and identity, yeah? And you might think, oh, well, actually my people, they're really close to each other, and they all believe in the great leader, and we've got like faster than light communications, so we can always keep an eye on everything that happens. Okay, you're still going to have different cultures, and you're still going to have different cultural identities, because the people who are living on the luscious verdant jungle planet, which is completely gorgeous, and they don't have to really fight for survival every day to keep themselves going, and they're supplied with everything that they could possibly want because they've got excellent supply lines, yeah, are going to be very, very different in their beliefs and how they act than the frontier world that is in a barren desert wasteland where the elements are extremely dangerous. They've got to survive quite like hard day to day to keep themselves just going, let alone producing for this nation. They only get like supply drop-offs or help now and again, and there aren't actually that many of them, so they have a much tighter sense of community. Yeah, that later portion is going to have a much more unified sense of identity as a group than the others. Yeah, the others are going to be more, let's just say, culturally inclined towards your greater empire as a whole, or at least what your empire is wanting to espouse culturally, than these other people later on. Okay, and just by virtue of being in a new place, even semi-isolated, different environment, different knowledge, different skills, different day-to-day experiences is going to create different culture. Yes, that culture is going to be very similar to others, but it's still going to be different. And that sometimes is enough to make people think different ways, to ask different questions, or to push back against the status quo in the mold, yeah? Even if those people have a different, let's say, special day that they worship for a particular dude who did a great deal for this budding mining community, and they hold a celebration of him on a particular day every year. It isn't done anywhere else in your nation, but it's done there. That's a unique cultural thing that only that planet has. Maybe even that community on that planet has, yeah? And that's what makes them unique. And therefore, maybe that community is much more in line with workers' rights and wanting to promote what workers can do for your nation as a whole, because they've seen that it's worked so well here. Therefore, they may try to gain influence and then push for certain rights in the larger nation. And this is where you have all of these different kind of places that people are now speaking from with their own unique takes. And this is something that you might think, Jesus, but Myrick, I can't be expected to write every single culture in my entire nation, even for 6 star systems and like 8 habitable planets. That's a lot of like people. Yeah, but you don't have to. My point is that you can have groups of individuals who are very different in your nation, okay? And through those groups, you can use them to write new characters. And those new characters are going to have different histories, different backgrounds, different beliefs, different cultural values than your more, let's just say, regular characters, okay? And that allows you to write from a different perspective, which allows you to tell a different perspective in story, which allows you to put spins on your existing story, which helps build up your story as a whole. And it helps show that your nation is an actual place that's lived in, and that you can then pick a random person at random from your nation and be able to describe their life, even in a couple sentences, yeah? Now, I'm not saying to go out and like type up all your different cultures. I'm saying that it's more kind of like basically just creating it spontaneously, yeah? Like, why not just create something spontaneously out of thin air? You can write down maybe major cultural groups in your sort of like nation sheet. That way people kind of know like what the, I guess, big groups are within your nation and what to expect. But don't be afraid to just create groups of people who are maybe even disgruntled and quite distinct from your existing nation for a role play or as a background for a character that you might want to do. There's any number of ways that you can go about this that just adds general source for your nation. And this isn't even got into the fact of intermingling yet, because you've got all these different cultures and you've got this kind of overarching state culture that I guess, is trying to espouse. It's all got to intermingle. So you're going to have areas where these different cultures overlap, which in turn creates new cultures, which assimilate values from either side, that creates new characters, that creates new backgrounds. Using these big cultural groups, again, especially if they're very distinct from each other, you can have these overlap zones as actual physical locations. Think about different areas in larger cities where you might have ethnic minorities in real life being in these areas where you will find much more different cultural values there, because there's people, living there that are somewhat different to you and me in their beliefs, what they may like, what they may enjoy, how their lives might be, and therefore it all intermingles, and you get some interesting, ramifications to that, both good and bad. Good for terms of development, bad in terms of what it might cause friction. It might up crime rates. It might cause, problems for your government. But there's so many ways that you can sort of create this sort of intermingling zone. You can have these crazy cities that are just so, flavorful. Think of all of the big kind of intermingled cities IRL, and how just crazy diverse they are in terms of what you can find, who you can find. I could go to London, for example, and I could go to any part of it, and I can find something that I would never find in any other part of, like, where I live in my county, for example. And I could go down a random street corner, and it would be extremely characterful, because there'll be stuff that I've not seen before. There'll be shops that I've not seen before. There'll be people that I've never met before. And most of the time, they'll be very, very different to me, And that is exciting, and it allows you to do a lot with it. So, also another thing to remember is this intermingling is not just for your own nations either. It's also for other nations. Lost Star is pretty much the best example I could possibly give you for the galaxy intermingling. Cultures from all over the galaxy go to Lost Star, and they set up shop, and they set up areas, and they all intermingle, and it's absolute chaos. But while it is chaos, it's absolutely fantastic for story purposes. If you ever want to run a story that you think, it's a bit kind of crazy, and I don't think I could run it in my nation, just run it on Lost Star. It's such a big place, and there's so much possibility there, that I guarantee you, whatever story kind of premise, even if it's a small character one, will pretty much exist there, just because there's so many different cultures that will interact there to create, crazy instances. So, these things don't have to be big. It can just be a character going down the street and finding, foreign food chains, for example, or foreign restaurants, or, a different kind of religious temple, for example. And it's little things like this that really, again, help the world feel lived in. Because if you could describe these little things that, yes, it's not two big battleships shooting at each other, but if you could describe these little things here and there, again, it makes it feel real. And if you get to know other players and other people in this server, well, you can include aspects of their culture in your nation in little throwaway lines and sentences. And that helps them, and they'll appreciate it. They'll appreciate the little nod, and they'll do the same for you. And through this, you can create this intermingling of cultures, not just in character, but out of character as well. And that can help you build better friendships in terms of, world building. So, with that, we will get on to, I guess, some sort of good examples of little things from culture that you can use to, I guess, flesh out a little bit more than would normally be the case. So, key cultural figures and dates are quite a mainstay, I would say, of at least modern societies. We can all think of prominent cultural figures for our respective countries. You could also probably think of, serious cultural dates for your country. It may be Independence Day from the United Kingdom, for example. I'm from the United Kingdom, so we don't have an Independence Day. So we're benevolent enough to bestow that cultural gift upon you for everyone's posterity. I'm joking, of course, but that is a major cultural thing for a lot of nations. You know, we gained independence from this other colonial nation. You know, we overthrew a tyrannical government, for example. We fought in the world wars. Yeah, like all of these different things add up, and obviously how important they are is, you know, dependent, and you can choose how kind of top heavy they are. You know, is it something that is really, really prevalent across the entire nation, or is it something that is more relegated to a single planet, for example? You know, is that cultural important figure somebody who is revered by everyone, or is it, you know, he was loved on several worlds for what he did, but actually hated on some other worlds because of heavy-handed policies or certain actions, for example, yeah? So, you know, it all depends. You will get all of these sort of historical figures and these particular dates where these events happened, and you're going to get people who are for and against. You know, oh, we celebrate Independence Day. Well, maybe there are people out there who are like, well, actually, we'd prefer to still be part of that country because we'd be doing better. So, you know, what has our sovereignty really gotten us other than, you know, a collapse in living standards, for example? So there may be people who actually are out there trying to push for, you know, reintegration or whatnot. Or, oh, well, this historic figure helped us win the war against these terrible people. Oh, yeah, but he also degraded our people's civil and political rights to the point of, you know, almost a total wipeout. And he also oppressed all of these other minorities and people that spoke out about him. So he was actually this horrible, horrible, tyrannical dictator, for example. So, you know, these are little things that you can sprinkle into your nation. They help you think about things, and they're kind of like little tasters that help you get the flavor sauce going, because then you can write different groups that think about different things and how they would approach those situations. Another thing really is, like, obviously, as we talked about, the environment, how the environment might shape your culture. You know, how do you as a person go about your day-to-day life in your environment? I can tell you now that, yeah, like, if you live somewhere like a really hot environment and you go to somewhere like Scandinavia or a really cold country, you're in for a cultural shock. I can tell you that much. You know, for example, Jesse, my Aussie friend in Ankh, he came over to the UK. I was there in shorts, no socks or shoes on, just a t-shirt, and he's there with him full woolly stuff because he's cold. I mean, to me, it's actually pretty good weather outside, but, you know, to him, it's deliberating. It's like, oh my god, this is terrible. But it's little minor things like that, you know. Colder climates tend to sort of harbour a much more unified existence in terms of, you know, everyone wants to stay together to keep warm in. Meanwhile, like hot environments, you might be continuously on the move at night just to try and keep yourself cool, for example, and to move on to other places where resources might not run out as quickly. So environmental factors also play a big part. Another one is norms and taboos. What are your cultural norms? What's normal to your people in your nation? And I want you all to think about what is culturally normal to you as a person from your country's culture. Because you might be thinking like, oh, well, you know, we eat this dish, or like, we do this thing, or like, we kind of believe this certain way. Like, yeah, but I can tell you now that your language is a norm. Yeah? How your slang works and your sort of like whole conlang and everything else works is a norm. That is deeply culturally ingrained. And I can also tell you that your language and how you may talk to other people will change culturally depending on where you are in your country. And that, again, is a cultural change. I, being in the UK, can go to another village just outside my town, and I can't understand what the hell people are saying. There's that much of a cultural difference, like, you know, language-wise. Fuck knows what half the people around here are saying. If you've ever watched Hot Fuzz with the farmer scene where he's just like, That's what it's like around here. So it is kind of like being in a foreign country sometimes, trying to translate. But your language is a norm for you. Your body language is also a norm. What is socially acceptable for you in your country will not be acceptable elsewhere. Certain body gestures or hand gestures are offensive in some countries, but not offensive in others. Yeah? And these are kind of tying into taboos as well. What might be culturally normal for you might be a really big taboo elsewhere. Having your meal given to you and then starting to eat may be a cultural taboo. Maybe you are supposed to sit there and somebody says a prayer of thanks, for example, or thank you for the people who are making it. How you dress is a cultural norm. I'm pretty sure most of us here in chat dress very differently from those who are in Dubai, for example, or in the Middle East, or who are Muslim, or who are Hindu. Yeah? We dress very differently. Again, dress matters in some places. Tone of voice also differs in some places. Music differs in a lot of places. And you've got all of these different kind of cultural norms that you can build off. And you can well build these really easily by just sitting there and thinking like, okay, what is it like in my life? And how would that be in my nation? What is my language like? What is the conlang like? What is the food like? What is the cultural preparation like in terms of food? What's clothing like? What is, your housing like? What's the living situation like? All of these different things that you can think of to then expand, and you can think about, how people get maybe be offended by certain things, and we don't expect this to obviously come up like super often in roleplay or whatever, but it's little things that you can put into certain roleplay posts that help build up your nation again and just make it feel that extra bit lived in. So, another big thing with culture is obviously going to be your history and the importance of heritage. Now, I intend for there to be a whole separate discussion purely around writing national history, because that is a very big topic, it's a very big can of worms, and it's very broad, okay? So I'll just kind of go over it. So obviously history is going to affect your entire nation. I mean, think about how much even the last 5 years of modern history has changed the world, for example, yeah? So it's something that you should really look into, yeah? I know a lot of nation roleplay individuals kind of gloss over history. They kind of go like, oh yeah, well, there was the Galactic invasion of 24 where, we got invaded and we fought off the invaders. And then this like big guy called Derek, who's kind of a chill dude and everyone loved him, came to power and just said, why don't I be the supreme leader? And then everyone loved him, and then he had a massive harem, and everyone wanted his children, and like he had superpowers, and now we're here today. And it's like, okay, yeah, right. But you don't have to have a long, super detailed history. You just need to have a history that flows well and that covers major events. And by major events, I mean events that may change your nation's culture, or society, or general outlook on the world, and how those changes affected them, and how those changes weave together to create your nation in the modern day. Because if I'm sitting there and you've got, Derek, the God Emperor of mankind, who everyone loves him and he's got superpowers, in the history, and I'm looking at like all the rest of your society, and it's this lovely liberal democracy where everyone is represented and whatnot, but Derek's still the big guy and everyone loves him. I'm gonna be like, what? Like, that doesn't really fit. History is how you got to now, and the major things that happened to get to now. Make it interesting. Make it crazy. Real life history is so fucking absolutely insane that I would never be able to get away with it if I wrote it down in Ancerious. Use that to your advantage. I'm not saying write the most batshit history you could possibly imagine, but I'm saying make it interesting, make it crazy, and have these things happen in logical, defined ways. And through these major events that, cause your nation to, say, pivot in certain directions, you will find heritage. And heritage being, the upholding, the preservation, and the analysation of, old events, old history. And that could be ancient and historical cultures. It could be ancient and historical sites, artifacts, places, events. It all depends. And then you can think of how your nation does that, yeah, and how that ties into things. Because if you're a feudalistic state with a lot of powerful families who have very long lineages stretching back, and they have very big histories, well, heritage is going to be a major part of your nation, and those families are going to take great care in upholding and preserving and trying to, put out there this heritage that they have of why they should be running the show, why they're this grandiose thing. And so, you can see how this heritage might impact your culture as a whole. And you could also then look into how heritage can be twisted and deformed and used for the benefit of the state or a particular goal or a particular culture, yeah? And that gives you, again, more avenues for storytelling and fleshing out your nation. Because just so your nation is as it is now doesn't mean it was the same 10 years ago, doesn't mean it was the same 20 years ago. Doesn't even mean it was the same 2 years ago. Culture is an ever-changing thing. Society is an ever-changing thing. That should be reflected in your history, okay? So, next up is counterculture. Now, counterculture is pretty simple in that it is literally just culture that goes counter to your existing culture. And you will always have it in your nation. Yeah, there will always be some kind of counterculture. I am personally an extremely left-leaning individual. I believe that the state is good. I believe that high taxes are good, and that the state should provide all of this stuff free of charge through my taxes. Yeah. However, you might not believe that. You might be like, well, actually, I'm quite a right-leaning individual, and I believe that everything should be deregulated, and the free market should be allowed to take over and do whatever the hell it wants, with little government intervention. The state should have very little intervention, and it should be up to everyone to individually do their part. Well, we're counter to each other, so that's a good example of counterculture right there, yeah? Just because your nation believes in a specific thing does not mean that everyone in your nation is going to believe the same thing. Now, yes, it can just take the form of people thinking different things. It can also be used to naturally distill my favourite part of world building and nation roleplay, things like terrorists and legitimate, let's just say, revolutionaries, yeah? Factions within your nation that are trying to undermine your government and turn it in a very specific direction in a quite fanatical sense, yeah? And quite extremist views. And this is where you can take certain cultures and certain belief systems, yeah, in your cultures from all these different backgrounds, and you can take them to their logical conclusion, and then you can take it a step beyond. What happens if they achieve their goals? What happens if we take this belief of, a big state that controls everything to its extreme? Well, I want a state that controls everything. I want a state that can keep an eye on me all the time and protect me. I want Big Brother. Or I want the state to be devolved entirely. I want anarchy. I want everyone to be their own person and no laws or whatever. You can take these cultural points and belief systems and societal beliefs and run with them and create, these groups that are kind of extremist, but you can also use this to create logical political parties. And if your state does not allow political parties, spheres of thought and influence, yeah? Maybe that culture is very prevalent in your nation. Therefore, logically, it should have a lot of sway in your government, whether that be by a big political party that is pushing that particular agenda of that culture, or a particular group of individuals, powerful individuals in your state, be that military or corporate or whatever, that are pushing a particular avenue, yeah? And then those parties can logically have their fanatical, zealous, extremist people who create your crazy, crazy extremists, yeah? So through this counterculture and even looking at normal culture, you can extrapolate loads of stuff about government, loads of crazy stuff like terrorist organizations and extremists, and you can help flesh out your entire state, more or less, from the bottom up, even so. And so this kind of worms into our next one of how to write cultural shifts. So culture is changing all the time, yeah? Society is always changing. I can tell you now that in the last 5 years, society's changed a lot. The culture has changed a lot in the UK. And things have shifted. And just like, our parents watched us grow up in a new kind of culture with the internet, I and many of us are watching younger people grow up with an even more different culture and immersion thanks to the internet and social media, yeah? That in itself is a major cultural shift. And that's only happened in the last 20 to 30 years. And even then, there are major things that have happened in that time that have shifted culture. Think about cultures in Europe or China or the United States, for example. And it's this ever-shifting landscape of change, yeah? Even within just nations as a whole. And so it should be like that in your nation as well. And I'm not saying, change your entire, nation every 2 months IRL or whatever. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that as time goes on, your nation will shift. And that shift will be facilitated by events, yeah? By what happens in your political scene, by what happens to your nation's economy, whether it goes up and down. What might happen if there is any major wars, for example, or geopolitical situations, or outside influence, or any number of things that can help shift a culture in a certain direction. Now, culture doesn't shift overnight, yeah? And because of that, any major cultural shift in your nation from a storytelling perspective should be done with care, and it should be done with build-up, with logical story progression, yeah, through character eyes, through certain points of views. You could follow a particular individual, be that a soldier, a politician, an average everyday citizen, who is going through the past, couple years of your nation's history. They've experienced the massive Ancerious financial crash. They've experienced a reduction in their living standards due to such. They have experienced 3AW and the, anti-native and anti-colonial stances. They have experienced how this has influenced the political scene and how it has influenced the economic scene and how you've watched a load of your people go off to fight a war. And you can then tell this story from their perspective of how their society and how their culture and how their beliefs are changing from the kind of the ground level, the nitty gritty, people aren't coming back from this war, maybe it's not going as well as the government said. Oh, well, under this government, we've kind of really suffered. Oh, well, I heard that this political party or this group of individuals actually have the right idea and they've got some pretty cool stuff going, maybe we should check them out. And in this way, you can help show, political change in your nation. You can help show cultural change in your nation. And you can help turn your nation from a particular way of thinking and object and stance in its history to a different point and show the progression and show that it happened logically from the bottom up. Not just, God Emperor Derek decided one day to step down and now everyone's a democratically elected super state. Like, it doesn't work like that. Tell a good story. Don't just narrate it. Tell it from the perspective of people, because we as readers are always going to empathize and connect to a character more than just narration. Yeah? And therefore, we're going to understand what's changing through their eyes, because we have experienced in our lifetimes things like that happening to us, so we can relate. Yeah? We all, well, at least possibly, most of us here in this chat lived through 9/11. We saw the world change. Yeah? We all have lived through the war in Ukraine. We have lived through COVID. Yeah, we've lived through many political scandals and situations. All of this has changed our opinion and the opinion of everyone else in our nations, and that has, changed things economically, politically, culturally, and so it's just best to help people experience it properly. Yeah. So I guess now it's good examples of cultures IRL and in Ancerios. So I'm actually going to ask Blue to give his opinions on this.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can.
So, what do you want? Good examples of cultures in real life, or
Real life in Ancerios, yeah.
um? I think you've already mentioned the United Kingdom, but I think the United Kingdom is a really great example of culture because it shows it on a lot of different levels. It shows you how it can impact other cultures. I'm pretty sure most people would be able to, if they know their national histories, could say something about the impact of British culture on their cultures and so forth, negatively or positively. Which shows how you had the British Empire. That was very much an imposition of British values. I mean, in India they had it was traditional things like Hindu practices back then. Like it was part of their practice to burn widows, and it was Britain and the British governors who were like, "Oh, that's against our values and our morals, and we have an imperative to enforce our cultural values and say that's not right." And force that, even if that was part of their culture and that was their ways. So that shows how international cultures can conflict. You have multiple different cultures in the United Kingdom. You got Scottish culture and Welsh cultures and Irish culture, and those themselves, if you look at history, um, are derivative of other cultures. Britain is itself a melting pot of various different cultures. You had the Anglo-Saxons, you had the Celts, which is where the Scottish and so forth get their identity. And that plays into a lot of their nationalist sort of imagery and how they try and separate themselves from the rest of Britain, because they like to present us by another culture that came into Britain and imposed themselves, the Normans or the Romans and so forth. So that shows you very much how cultures can build up over time, and they can play into different things, especially in terms of nationalism. I mean, we use Boudica, which is a national cultural character in our history, and it became sort of a symbol in many ways. Winston Churchill's another one, Horatio Nelson, and so they become iconic. But at the same time, as Marek also hinted, if you go to different villages and so forth, there's entirely different cultures. Each city pretty much has its own culture. Britain's a really good example of this, where you have different dialects and so forth, even if you just crossed over as like a single county. So I'm assuming most people here are in some way Anglophone or English speaking, so it makes a very easy sort of case study, if you will, for uh, a real world sort of one. Do you want others, or do you think that's a good one?
Go on, give me something a bit more exotic.
Exotic. So I mean, Spanish or Spain, they've got a lot of different cultures and they've got traditions and so forth that many people would be absurd. You know, bullfighting, modern day, they that comes into their cultural heritage. They describe that as sort of bullfighting. However, modern cultural moralities and ideas of things like, you know, animal rights and so forth, um, that's caused like a developing modern conflict between like, oh well, this is part of our tradition, this is part of what makes us us, it's part of our Spanish heritage and identity and so forth, whilst a lot of modern day Spanish people, I think, would probably be like, no, 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 not. I mean, it's being banned in a lot of the Latin world, I think. um, so you got that kind of thing. You've got the Galicians, you've got the Basque themselves being another. I think, I don't even think they're Celtic, I think they're something even older.
The
If I
Basque people
correct,
are very old, yeah.
yeah, I mean, I remember yeah. So you get the point. They are very old culture, and that plays into them even to this day, and that also ties them to political identities. Because if people know Spanish history, Spain used to be a dictatorship, a fascist dictatorship through most of the 1900s, really under Franco. Um, and so when the Basque people wanted separation, the main ideological group that took root were the communists and the socialists, because it's very difficult to make an opposition group if you're nationalist or you're cultural and so forth, and you're going, oh, well, our culture is too distinct and so forth, um, while simultaneously holding the same cultural values. Um, it's not very persuasive, which is also why the Irish separatists and so forth tend to be socialist and all this kind of thing. Um, so I would point at Spain as another one, because there's a lot of, you know, the Galicians themselves, they're more Portuguese than anything, but most people don't really realize that, and they don't have a very strong like separatist movement, from my understanding. There's a lot of Muslim influences in southern Spain because of their history, in Andalusia, and because Spain used to be part of the Muslim world before the Reconquista. Um, Culture as well is a really nebulous thing because it's separate from nationality. Because most of like Eastern Europe, as an example, you have Ukrainian, you have Ruthenian, you have Belarusian, you have Lithuanian, I didn't mention that before, and Polish. But if you go back to the early 1900s, back when a lot of the like European nation states were being founded properly in like more modern day nations, one of the big things that they had as a problem with Polish is that Poland historically was this huge monolithic like empire that encompassed, like I mentioned, the Ukrainians, the Ruthenians, the Lithuanians, and the Poles, and they wanted to maintain this idea of Polishness as a like a cultural idea, um, or like a national idea that was separate from the culture. You know, if you look at differences between the Polish and the Ukrainians, they're very distinct, like in their culture and their language and so forth. But their collective heritage, their Slavicness, and all this kind of thing. The Poles attempted to create this idea of like a Polish intercultural entity. The Russians have tried to do this in many cases before. The Russians got involved in World War One because of the idea of Pan-Slavism, that because they're such a big Slavic empire, the biggest, they had a cultural responsibility to protect the smaller Slavic cultures. That's why they protected Serbia. That's why they got very annoyed when Austria invaded and annexed Bosnia. In China, even to modern day discourse, they maintain this idea of a multicultural nation, that China is not a single culture, it's not a mono-ethnic nation. It is a nationality built on an idea rather than a specific culture and ways. And so historically they had these different the flag of the five races or something, the Manchurians and the Han and all this kind of thing. And that was a core idea as to what justified their nation. And the idea that if we start focusing on being like, we're this nationality and stuff, it all starts to break down, the cohesion collapses. And even to modern day, a lot of the Chinese people and Chinese sort of nationalists and so forth will espouse this idea that they're rejecting Western ideas of what it is, like the idea of nationality being the same as culture or ethnicity and all this kind of thing. So I would suggest looking into this kind of thing, because it's Eurasianism, generally speaking, is an entire cultural idea. In more specific sort of traditions that are like kind of out there, I've already mentioned bullfighting. For Britain, like I know a lot of Americans get baffled when I mention that we have if I recall correctly, 5th of November, bonfire night. And I go, what is that? And I go, well, what we do is we collect a bunch of wood and put it all together. We start firing off fireworks. We create these giant bonfires, and then we burn these effigies of like an anti-monarchist guy from the 1600s who wanted to blow up Parliament. And they're like, why? Because we hated this guy, we want to burn him, and we want to go, yeah, like, we are like physically imagining it's this guy, and we're burning him alive. It's a baffling thing for them, and when you think about it, it's a baffling tradition. It's like, what? But it's like a tradition doesn't necessarily have to make sense by our own principles and so forth. It's just something that we've picked up over time. I'm struggling to think of other like nations sort of more baffling ones.
There
And
are quite a lot of examples of people burning effigies. It seems to be, and it's a case for just like kind of absurd things happening organically. In Russian culture, you have Maslenitsa, where there's also a burning of an effigy, and is followed by a day of eating pancakes. And in Switzerland, there's Fastnacht, where people go in parades with these kind of like hideously proportioned like costumes, people with big noses and crazy hair. And the idea is to scare away the winter. And so there's everywhere you look, you have kind of absurd, interesting cultural tidbits that you can take inspiration from.
I think as well, it's important to notice that there's a running theme of this idea of like geographic separation within nations. I mean, in America, you've got North and South, the Dixie and the Yankees or so forth, or the West and the East Coast or like rural versus urban. These are cultural separations. In Germany, I believe there's a feeling of separation between the Southern Germans and the North Germans, and I think that derives a lot more from like their religious separation, dating all the way back to the Reformation. You have like the idea of the Catholic South and the Protestant North, and this builds that had a strong influence. You've got, of course, Oktoberfest in Bavaria, and so geography can play a huge role even within your nation, even if it's not like a vitriolic, like, oh, we hate these guys, we want to actually kill them or something. It can create like these friendly rivalries. I mean, people always talk about how we like Britain and like France hate each other. We've got an alliance and so forth, and like most of history, I think, like at least the 20th century, Britain and France has acted more like towards each other's goals, I think, than Britain and America. That's a controversial opinion, but it shows that it's not necessary. You can have a separation of cultural rivalries and separation, and it doesn't necessarily have to reflect on how your nations behave. So yeah, going to Ancerious, I think, Marek, you wanted to talk more about Ancerious things. Do you want me to move on to that?
Yeah, let's get some good examples of Ancerious cultures.
Yeah, do you want me to go, or you?
Yeah, go.
So obviously I can talk most about my personal faction, the ASN, the Associated States of Natal, which itself is a veritable smorgasbord of different nationalities and cultures and subcultures. That basically I like to describe them as a bunch of different cultures acting as one nation, like a bunch of people, like little children in an overcoat pretending to be an adult. It's kind of like that. I've done tons of different maps and stuff that you don't need to see, but point is, there's like 87 nations and hundreds of cultures, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not able to act as one entity. And and even though they have a lot of separation between like this idea of monarchism and the role of like this giant statist monarchy that's almost Stalinist in the way it justifies itself to the modern day, and other ones that are Republican and diehard with, don't tread on me, don't interfere with people's day-to-day lives, they're capable of acting together as a single nation because there's this prevailing cultural ethos that was affected very much by an event early in Natar's history, which was the Samsur War, which is after it entered space. It was kind of isolationist, almost like Japan used to be. And then it got suddenly attacked by a mining fleet. And because they had been isolated for so long, and they weren't rapidly trying to do everything they could to modernize and prepare themselves for galactic stuff, and they weren't integrated into galactic technology and all this kind of thing, they didn't really stand a chance, and they were divided culturally, and they were still competing with each other, and they very nearly just got occupied and absorbed by this mining company that was run by some criminal empire somewhere. It was the Union that saved them. And it was also the Union that made first contact with them. And so even though Natar to this day, and in response to the Samsur War, which, by the way, they rapidly began modernizing, they went completely in the other direction. They broke away all regulations, all stoppers on migration, on trade, and all this kind of thing. And they just took everything they could. They had pirate hideouts. There were cannibal bars that were just completely normal now. They had every kind of immorality in order to attract as much money, as much investment, as much development as they could. And it caused them to skyrocket up in the galaxy, but it also caused a lot of their cultures to be flattened out. Now it's very homogenized and consumer culture. And as I was about to say, because the Union had done first contact to save them, even though they're this ultra capitalist, ultra development, ultra economic, globalist kind of thing, they don't particularly care ideologically when interacting with the Union of Worlds, because they see it as the mother state, or they refer to it as the mother empire or something like that. Not in a way that they're believe that they're submissive to it, but it's kind of like a complimentary statement that they were this nation that came forward and helped them when they could, and by that way they act in good faith. So that is how events can really affect your cultural outlook of your peoples and so forth. You can have dozens of little cultures, but you can have these more prevalent sort of impacts by economic change or political change that cause them to conflict with their own principles. Like I mentioned, that they can become these completely immoral people because they're so desperate for national or international safety. You have them against their own principles or ideas that they just created, now cooperating with an ideologically opposed nation because of the context of that more recent events. So that's a really long-winded way of describing how you can do tons of different things and events, and how you can have them play off of how your people view things and behave. Smaller, more particular things, because they view humanity as this established civilized people that have got all this advancement and stuff, that aristocratic echelons and stuff, it's fashionable to almost pretend that you're human. They have these sort of almost masquerade balls, but they dress up like humans and they put on these porcelain human masks and so forth. If you were a person and you saw a bunch of aliens wearing the equivalent, almost wearing human skin faces and stuff and looking around it, you'd go, what the? And you'd be terrified and scared. But to them, it's almost it's like a furry convention or something, because they don't realize that. They don't realize from another person's perspective how bizarre that is, because it's just we're just dressing up as another species, So that's a small example of a more particular event. Is there anything you want to talk about, Marek, on another nation before I think of something?
Not really a nation per se, but I've got to mention the Unmar, because if I don't, I know that Boomy is going to come in the night and castrate me. I don't know a huge amount about the Unmar, but I know that it is like a region that's been quite built up heavily with different cultures, different societies that are all interlinked and intermingled by a lot of shared history, all to do with these different nations working together or fighting each other or whatnot. Uh, so, like, definitely check that out if you're wanting to sort of learn more about the cultural side of things. But yeah.
Should I provide a kind
Oh,
of summary of the Eastern?
yeah, of course you can.
Without being too granular, and I guess like kind of taking the applicable writing concepts from it. Um, Out of character, uh, this was a region that just happened to be very densely populated for no historic reason at the time. So basically, a bunch of us writers banded together and decided to make somewhat of a communal war building project to create history in different cultures. And a lot of us have had quite a bit of fun doing this, and I would really recommend it. The Tuvian Arm is doing a similar project. Um, and kind of a lot of culture I find uh, can emerge organically, and just synthesizing events, existing history, and national identities together, and then considering how it all intermingles is a very effective way of being able to ascertain culture and cultural shifts. There have been like, at least like in the Ridge, because a lot of the nations who ended up coming out like quote unquote on top after a very like turbulent period, uh, since a lot of them were kind of capitalistic, some of them somewhat democratic, this kind of cosmopolitan, modernistic viewpoint has taken hold and began to shape um, the kind of identity of the region. And due to the very pervasive like openness of borders, there has been a a culture without a nation. They're called dandelions because they get everywhere and they kind of stick, and they're kind of somewhat weeds. They don't identify with any of the rich states. Instead, they kind of live in between all of them. And I believe you see a similar thing happen in the Killian Verge, where there's a lot of interconnectedness. So yeah, one of the most fun ways to ascertain culture is to work with people who you enjoy working with, and to find people to do stuff with.
Definitely. All right. Well, I think that ties us nicely into any questions, I guess. Any questions at all in comms text chat? If you have any, write them up. And I will endeavour to ask.
I have a question.
Go for it.
How would another culture say? Is there any cultures that hate each other in Ankh, like they're just ideologically or culturally opposed to each other? You know?
I mean, yeah, like, pretty much the Aurelians pretty much like almost entirely culturally hate the colonials because their entire existence is built around like emphasizing the damage that the colonials have supposedly done to Aurelia, and thus they've kind of made it this whole icon and their heritage, and that they need to expulse the colonials from the galaxy. Um, so yeah. Um, you've also got like there's a lot of different cultures that just hate each other in the galaxy due to a wide variety of reasons. Um, can political events happen in RP, like local ones influence culture, and what's the best way to write out their effects culturally? Yeah, those are the political events that would be shifting your culture. Even local ones, again, the best way to write out their effects um, in a way that is effectively just like, through the point of view of someone. Help give a point of view, help give a character's frame of reference that allows people to relate, and therefore you can then effectively move through. So, what is the worst culture in Ancerios? Not the poorest written, the one that is quite well written but meant to be the most horrific, disgusting culture to other nations' views. So, I don't know if this is the most, like, horrific culture, but there is, in modern capital, the culture of Strixism, which is an ideology built around getting the absolute most out of an individual, work-wise. Now, when you think of that, you'll think, oh, it means that everyone's in the mines 24/7. That is not how it works. Strixism uses psychological, economic, societal, cultural, physical, and mental engineering to ensure that you, as an individual in a Strixist society, outputs the absolute maximum output of productivity that you can give society. Okay? And that means that you may work 18-hour days for 6 weeks straight. Okay? But then you might have 3 weeks off. And in those 3 weeks off, you will have the most perfect vacation that you could ever want. And it's all paid for by the state. And while you're doing this Strixus work, you will be given really nice food and given proper sleeping meds, and you will effectively be in a position where you are always on the absolute border of breaking down and just ceasing to function, because you are pushing yourself to the absolute limit that you can to contribute to your to this society, yeah. But you're always prevented from tipping over the edge by personalized engineering, and so you live a life of just productivity. And that's effectively what Strixism is, controlling every aspect of your life, and social and personal engineering. So like, it's this kind of like, oh yeah, you get all this nice stuff, and the state gives you all of this awesome stuff, but every aspect of your life is controlled, and you're expected to like work until you die. So, and if you break down, you basically get disposed of. So, and obviously there's different cultures around the different main capitals that are trying to vie to be the most productive. Meanwhile, in the other systems that aren't one of the four capitals, you are working in a Strixist environment, but without the super nice privilege luxury keeping you going, and you are merely an expendable tool. And therefore you are expected to work, with all of your planet's output and all of your output going to fueling the four capitals to turn them into this, like, shining exemplar of what will become this new nation built on this, like, incredibly good foundation. And so, like, you've got all these different cultures, all these different ideologies inside trying to, like, think, oh, well, actually, humans aren't a perfect form for Strixism because we have mental breakdowns. Therefore, we need to genetically engineer ourselves into some, like, horrific abomination to try and get the perfect form to, emphasize Strixism. Or, actually, we're not going far enough and we just need to push people, like, over the edge just to get everything out of them, or like, actually we should do this over a longer period of time. And all of these different ideologies and cultures from different areas within the nation that are all building up to just be this dystopian hellscape, more or less. Any other questions? Okay, I don't see anyone typing, so I assume that is a good thing. Oh, somebody's typing. I shall wait until they post their question. Faster. Type fast. It's fine. Are there examples where an idea for a culture became the nation? Uh, yeah, I mean, like if you want a good example, Australia and the United States, I would say, are pretty, and Blue can back me up on this, pretty good examples of where people who originated from an existing culture created their own culture and then through that created an actual like IRL state, its own entity, its own culture.
Mhm.
I think that would be really good examples for that. Um, um, what about deviancy in culture? Stuff like the seven deadly sins. I guess that would come into under stuff that we talked about earlier, like traditional societal and cultural norms and taboos. What would be considered a sin or a taboo in one nation may be quite different for another, and how that will change depending on the culture. Um, uh, has the art of writing a culture that's survivalist by nature come up at all? I mean, it has, but it kind of ties into, I guess, what we've been saying all along, in that, if your culture is a very survivalist orientated one, it's going to be focusing very specific things, and it's going to be believing in very specific ways. It's going to have developed a very specific, I guess, layout. Um, is there really an international language? In Ancerios, yes, it's called Galactic Common. It's assumed to be some kind of English. However, there's a bit of a meme going around, which is it actually sounds like really bad Cockney stereotypical like English. Um, but I refuse to believe that's the case. All right. Well, if that's it for that, thank you all for coming, and we will catch you next time.